The control tower was silent except for the hum of failing electronics. 3 days without resupply, communications down across the entire grid, and storm systems rolling in from the west with no sign of breaking. The base commander stared at the weather radar, watching red zones expand across their only viable flight corridors. Outside, seasoned pilots with decades of experience shook their heads and walked away from their aircraft. The mission was impossible. They said no one could fly in those conditions for the time it would take. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But in the corner of the operations center, a woman with grease-stained coveralls and weekend reserve patches on her shoulders was already calculating fuel consumption rates and plotting waypoints through gaps in the storm system that others couldn't see. They had always called her the weekend warrior, the part-timer who showed up twice a month to play pilot. What they didn't know was that she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. The alarm clock in apartment 4B never rang at 0430 because it didn't need to. Lieutenant Sarah Chun's body had learned the rhythm years ago, long before she'd ever set foot on a military base. While her neighbors slept through their weekday routines, she was already dressed and moving through the pre-dawn darkness toward Grayson Air National Guard Base, a thermos of black coffee in one hand and a worn leather flight bag in the other. The highway stretched empty before her headlights, asphalt still damp from overnight rain. Most people driving this route at this hour were heading to factory shifts or hospital rounds, but Sarah was different. She drove this road every weekend, every holiday, every moment of leave time she could manage from her civilian job. The base appeared in the distance like a small city of lights, runway beacons cutting through the morning mist in precise intervals. Sarah's weekday life existed in a glass office building downtown where she worked as an aerospace engineer for Morrison Defense Contractors. Her colleagues knew her as the quiet woman who ate lunch alone while reading technical manuals, who declined happy hour invitations because she had somewhere else to be. They didn't know that somewhere else was a world where she transformed from Sarah Chun, cubicle dweller, into Lieutenant Chun, pilot. The security gate recognized her ID before she'd even rolled down the window. Sergeant Williams, the weekend guard, raised his hand in greeting. "Morning, Lieutenant. You're early again." "Always am, Sergeant. Most of the weekend warriors don't show up until 0800. You've been here since before I started my shift." Sarah nodded and drove through the gate. The term weekend warrior had followed her since her first day in the Air National Guard. It wasn't meant as a compliment. Weekend warriors were the part-timers, the hobbyists, the people who showed up once a month to maintain their military obligations while living civilian lives. They were seen as less committed, less skilled, less worthy of respect than their full-time active duty counterparts. Sarah had never been like the other weekend warriors. Where others fulfilled their minimum requirements and went home, she stayed. Where others treated their military service as a secondary obligation, she approached it with the intensity of someone whose life depended on it. Because in a way, it did. The flight line at Grayson was home to a mixed squadron of C-130 Hercules transport aircraft, workhorses designed for cargo hauling, troop transport, and missions that required getting into places where other aircraft couldn't go. Sarah had been flying C-130s for 6 years, accumulating hours in conditions that would challenge pilots with twice her experience. She knew every bolt, every wire, every system in those aircraft better than she knew her own apartment. Her assigned aircraft, tail number 847, sat in the third hangar from the east. She'd requested the same plane for every training flight, every mission, every hour of practice time. The ground crew had started calling it Sheen's Bird because she spent more time with it than anyone else. Sarah approached the aircraft in the dim hangar lighting, her boots echoing against the concrete floor. The C-130 was not a beautiful aircraft. It was functional, utilitarian, designed for reliability rather than elegance. But to Sarah, it represented something more. It was a capability made manifest, the tool that could reach people when they needed help most. She ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling for any irregularities in the metal skin, then began her inspection routine. Most pilots did their pre-flight checks according to the manual, following the prescribed sequence and moving on. Sarah's inspections were different. She checked everything twice, then checked it again. She tested systems that weren't scheduled for testing, verified readings that were within normal parameters, and noted details that others might consider insignificant. Her pre-flight checklist was 3 pages longer than regulation required, filled with additional items she'd added based on technical manuals she'd studied and scenarios she'd researched. The fuel system required special attention. Sarah climbed onto the wing and physically inspected each fuel port, checking for contamination, water intrusion, and proper sealing. She took samples from each tank and tested them with a portable analysis kit she'd purchased with her own money. The base's fuel was reliable, but Sarah had read incident reports from other installations where contaminated fuel had caused engine failures. She refused to accept that risk. Inside the cockpit, she powered up the avionics and began her electronic systems check. The K-130's instrument panel was a complex array of gauges, switches, and digital displays that controlled everything from navigation to engine performance. Sarah's fingers moved across the controls with practiced precision, but her eyes were looking for things that weren't in the manual. She checked the backup systems for the backup systems, verified the calibration of instruments that were working perfectly, and tested emergency protocols that had never been activated. Her flight bag contained items that other pilots didn't carry. Along with the standard charts and emergency procedures, she had detailed weather analysis software on a ruggedized tablet, alternative navigation charts for routes not in the standard database, and communication equipment that could operate on frequencies the base's radios couldn't access. She'd spent thousands of her own dollars on equipment that might someday prove necessary. The other weekend warriors began arriving around 0800, trickling into the operations, building with coffee cups and casual conversations about their civilian jobs. Major Bradley, the weekend operations officer, was a real estate agent during the week. Captain Morrison sold insurance. Lieutenant Torres managed a restaurant chain. They were good people, competent pilots, but their military service was something they did alongside their real lives. Sarah's relationship with her civilian job was different. She worked at Morrison Defense Contractors because the position gave her access to technical information about military aircraft systems, logistics protocols, and operational procedures that she couldn't get anywhere else. Her engineering background allowed her to understand aircraft systems at a level that pure flight training couldn't provide. She used her security clearance to access technical bulletins, incident reports, and classified operational data that helped her understand how aircraft performed in extreme conditions. During her lunch breaks at Morrison, while her colleagues discussed television shows and weekend plans, Sarah studied failure analysis reports from C-130 operations in Afghanistan. She researched weather patterns that affected high-altitude flight in mountainous terrain. She analyzed fuel consumption data from extended-range missions and calculated performance parameters for scenarios that existed only in her imagination. Her supervisors at Morrison considered her a dedicated employee who worked quietly and efficiently. They didn't know that she was using her position to prepare for military scenarios that might never occur. Sarah had built an extensive database of technical information that she reviewed constantly, always looking for details that might prove relevant to her weekend service. The weekend training missions were routine cargo runs, usually involving flights to other bases within a few hundred miles. Sarah approached each one with the intensity of a combat mission, She studied the route for days in advance, researching weather patterns, alternative airfields, and emergency procedures specific to the terrain they'd be flying over. She calculated fuel requirements for multiple scenarios, planned for contingencies that weren't part of the mission briefing, and prepared backup plans for situations that had never occurred. Other pilots found her preparation excessive. "It's just a training flight, Chun," Captain Morrison told her once. "We're hauling supplies to Patterson Air Force Base. It's a 2-hour flight in clear weather. You don't need to plan like we're flying into a war zone." But Sarah couldn't operate any other way. Every flight was an opportunity to practice procedures she might someday need under emergency conditions. Every mission was a chance to test her knowledge against real-world challenges. She flew as if someone's life depended on her performance. Because she believed that someday someone's life would, the weekends at Grayson followed a predictable pattern. Morning briefings covered the day's training objectives, weather conditions, and safety procedures. The missions themselves were straightforward cargo runs or training exercises designed to maintain pilot proficiency. Most of the weekend warriors completed their requirements and headed home by late afternoon, returning to their civilian lives until the next monthly training period. Sarah stayed longer. After the official training ended, she requested permission to fly additional practice missions. She volunteered for maintenance test flights when aircraft systems needed verification after repairs. She spent hours in the base's flight simulator, practicing emergency procedures and unusual flight conditions. The simulator room was usually empty after duty hours, but Sarah had arranged for 24-hour access, allowing her to practice during times when others weren't available. Her simulation sessions weren't random practice. Sarah had developed a systematic training program based on real-world scenarios she'd researched. She practiced flying in severe weather conditions, simulated engine failures at critical moments, and trained for emergency landings in hostile environments. She created scenarios that pushed her skills beyond normal training requirements, always preparing for situations that were more challenging than anything she'd actually experienced. The base's flight instructors began to notice her dedication. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the senior enlisted flight engineer, started staying late to observe her simulation sessions. He'd seen many pilots come and go during his 20-year career, but Sarah's approach was different. She wasn't just maintaining proficiency. She was pushing herself toward a level of expertise that few pilots ever achieved. "Lieutenant Chen," he said one evening as she finished a particularly challenging simulation, "I've been watching you train. For months, you're preparing for something specific. What is it?" Sarah powered down the simulator and looked at him directly. "I'm preparing for the mission that nobody thinks will happen. The one where everything goes wrong at once, where the weather is impossible, where the equipment fails, and where there's no backup plan. I'm preparing for the moment when someone needs a pilot who can do the impossible." Master Sergeant Rodriguez nodded slowly. He'd seen enough combat to understand what she meant. "That's a heavy burden to carry, Lieutenant. Most pilots hope they never face that kind of situation." "I'm not most pilots, Sergeant. I'm a weekend warrior who believes that part-time service doesn't mean part-time preparation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah's apartment reflected her dual existence. The living room contained the furniture and decorations of a normal civilian life, but the spare bedroom had been converted into a study that looked like a military planning center. Aviation charts covered one wall, marked with routes, weather patterns, and notes about terrain features. A large desk held multiple computers running flight planning software, weather analysis programs, and communication systems that kept her connected to military networks. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with technical manuals, operational procedures, and historical accounts of military aviation. Sarah had collected every piece of literature she could find about C-130 operations, from basic flight manuals to classified after-action reports that she'd accessed through her security clearance. She read constantly, always looking for information that might prove relevant to her military service. Her personal library included books about weather systems, navigation techniques, and aircraft maintenance procedures. She'd studied the technical specifications of every system in the C-130, memorized the performance characteristics of the aircraft under various conditions, and learned to recognize the signs of potential failures before they became critical. This knowledge went far beyond what was required for her weekend service. But Sarah believed that comprehensive preparation was the foundation of effective performance. The wall above her desk held a single photograph, carefully mounted and prominently displayed. It showed a young man in a flight suit standing beside a C-130, his arm around the shoulders of a teenage girl. The man was Captain David Chun, Sarah's older brother, who had died in a training accident 7 years earlier. The girl was Sarah herself, visiting David's base during a family vacation. David had been everything Sarah aspired to become as a pilot. He served as a full-time active duty officer, flying missions around the world and earning the respect of his peers through competence and dedication. He'd been scheduled to deploy to Afghanistan when his aircraft experienced a mechanical failure during a routine training flight. The investigation determined that the failure was unforeseeable, a combination of factors that couldn't have been prevented. But Sarah had studied the incident report in detail, analyzing every factor that contributed to the accident. She'd identified several small details that might have made a difference if they'd been handled differently. The knowledge that her brother's death might have been preventable drove her to pursue a level of preparation that went beyond normal requirements. She couldn't bring David back, but she could ensure that she would never face a similar situation without being ready. Sarah's civilian colleagues at Morrison Defense Contractors saw her as a dedicated but unremarkable employee. She completed her assignments efficiently, participated in meetings when required, and maintained professional relationships with her coworkers. But her real focus was always on her military service. She used her civilian position to access information that supported her weekend training, building expertise that would serve her military role. The contrast between her civilian and military identities was stark. At Morrison, she was Sarah Chun, aerospace engineer, quiet and methodical. At Grayson, she was Lieutenant Chen, pilot, intense and focused. Her civilian co-workers knew she served in the Air National Guard, but they saw it as a hobby, something she did on weekends for extra money and benefits. They didn't understand that her military service was her true calling, the work that gave her life meaning and purpose. Sarah's preparation extended beyond technical knowledge to physical and mental conditioning. She maintained a rigorous exercise routine designed to prepare her for the physical demands of extended flight operations. She practiced meditation techniques that would help her maintain focus during stressful situations. She studied human factors in aviation, learning to recognize the signs of fatigue, stress, and decision-making errors that could compromise flight safety. Her dedication to preparation had made her one of the most knowledgeable pilots in the squadron. But it had also set her apart from her peers. Other weekend warriors found her intensity intimidating. They fulfilled their military obligations competently, but didn't share her obsessive attention to detail. Sarah's approach to military service was fundamentally different from theirs, driven by a sense of responsibility that went beyond normal requirements. The monthly training exercises at Grayson were designed to maintain basic proficiency in C-130 operations. Sarah approached each exercise as if it were a critical mission, preparing extensively and performing at the highest level possible. Her performance evaluations were consistently excellent, but her reputation as a weekend warrior meant that she wasn't considered for the more challenging assignments that went to full-time active duty pilots. This distinction frustrated Sarah, but it also motivated her to continue improving. She knew that her part-time status would always limit her opportunities, but she refused to let it limit her preparation. She studied harder than the full-time pilots, practiced more intensively than her peers, and maintained a level of readiness that surpassed what was expected of weekend warriors. The base's operations center was where Sarah spent much of her time when not flying. She monitored weather conditions, tracked aircraft movements, and studied mission reports from operations around the world. The duty officers had become accustomed to her presence, knowing that she was always available to help with complex problems or unusual situations. Her technical knowledge and analytical skills made her a valuable resource, even though her weekend warrior status meant she couldn't be officially assigned to critical operations. Sarah's relationship with the full-time staff at Grayson was complex. They respected her competence and dedication, but they also maintained the institutional bias that favored active duty personnel over weekend warriors. She was seen as exceptional for a part-timer, but still not quite equal to the full-time pilots, who were considered the squadron's core capability. This attitude didn't discourage Sarah. It focused her determination. She knew that she might never receive the recognition or opportunities that came with full-time service, but she also knew that her preparation would eventually prove its worth. She was ready for challenges that others couldn't imagine, trained for scenarios that existed only in her planning, and equipped with knowledge that went far beyond normal requirements. The weekend training cycle at Grayson followed a predictable schedule, but Sarah treated each iteration as a new opportunity to refine her skills. She approached familiar missions with fresh intensity, always looking for ways to improve her performance or prepare for variations that might occur in real operations. Her logbook showed hundreds of hours of flight time, but each entry represented deliberate practice toward a level of mastery that few pilots ever achieved. As the months passed, Sarah's reputation as the most prepared weekend warrior in the squadron grew. Other pilots began seeking her advice on technical questions, knowing that she had likely researched the answer in detail. The maintenance crews appreciated her thorough pre-flight inspections, which occasionally caught problems that might have been missed by less careful pilots. Her dedication to preparation had earned her respect, even if it had also earned her the persistent label of weekend warrior. But Sarah knew that labels were temporary, and preparation was permanent. She continued training, studying, and refining her skills, always working toward a level of readiness that would allow her to handle any situation that might arise. She was building capability that went far beyond what was expected of a part-time pilot, driven by the certainty that someday someone would need a pilot who could do the impossible. The foundation of her preparation was complete. The knowledge had been acquired, the skills had been developed, and the equipment had been gathered. Sarah Chun, the weekend warrior, was ready for whatever challenge might come. She just didn't know that the challenge would arrive sooner than anyone expected, in a form that would test every aspect of her preparation and force her to prove that part-time service didn't mean part-time capability. The emergency notification arrived at 0347 on a Tuesday morning in March, jolting Sarah from sleep with its urgent electronic chime. Her phone displayed a message from the Crisis Response Network, a system that monitored global military operations and flagged potential threats to U.S. installations. The alert was brief but concerning. Comsat disruption detected Pacific Theater. Multiple installations reporting degraded communications. Stand by for further updates. Sarah sat up in bed, immediately alert. Communication satellite disruptions weren't unusual, but widespread outages affecting multiple installations suggested something more serious than routine technical problems. She accessed her secure tablet and pulled up the military communications monitoring system she'd configured to track unusual patterns in global military networks. The data streaming across her screen painted a troubling picture. Starting at 020 Zulu time, Military communication satellites across the Pacific had begun experiencing systematic interference. The pattern wasn't random technical failure. It was coordinated, deliberate, and expanding. Sarah's analysis software highlighted anomalies that suggested electronic warfare capabilities being deployed against U.S. military communications infrastructure. At Morrison Defense Contractors, Sarah's civilian colleagues were unaware of the developing situation. The company's work involved domestic aerospace projects, and most employees didn't have access to the global military intelligence networks that Sarah monitored. She arrived at her office at 0630, maintaining her normal routine while internally processing the implications of what she'd observed. Her security clearance at Morrison gave her access to classified assessments of foreign military capabilities, including electronic warfare systems that could disrupt satellite communications. The patterns she'd identified matched theoretical models of coordinated attacks on military communication networks. If her analysis was correct, the disruption wasn't accidental. It was a probe, testing the vulnerabilities of U.S. military communications. Before a larger operation, Sarah's cubicle at Morrison was strategically positioned near the Secure Communications Center, where classified information flowed between defense contractors and military installations. Throughout the morning, she monitored the classified networks, watching as the communication disruption spread from the Pacific to other regions. Reports filtered in from installations worldwide, describing degraded communications, failed satellite links, and increasing reliance on backup systems. The pattern became clearer as the day progressed. The disruptions were targeting specific types of military communications, focusing on the networks that connected remote installations to their command structures. Forward bases, isolated outposts, and specialized facilities were being systematically cut off from their support networks. Sarah recognized the strategy: isolate the targets, disrupt their communications, then exploit their vulnerability. Her analysis at Morrison was interrupted by a call from Master Sergeant Rodriguez at Grayson. His voice carried an urgency that was unusual for routine guard communications. "Lieutenant Chun, we need you at the base immediately. There's a situation developing that requires your technical expertise." Sarah left Morrison without explanation, driving toward Grayson through midday traffic that seemed obliviously normal. The world around her continued its routine functions while she processed the implications of a coordinated attack on military communications infrastructure. Her mind raced through contingency scenarios, analyzing the potential responses to systematic communication disruption. The operations center at Grayson was buzzing with activity when Sarah arrived. Maps covered the walls, showing the locations of affected installations across the Pacific and beyond. Communication technicians worked frantically to establish contact with bases that had gone silent. The atmosphere was tense, filled with the urgency of people trying to understand a rapidly evolving crisis. Colonel Martinez, the base commander, was coordinating with higher headquarters when Sarah entered the operations center. His face showed the strain of managing a situation that was beyond normal operational parameters. He noticed Sarah's arrival and motioned for her to join the group of officers gathered around the main display screen. "Lieutenant Chun, your timing is perfect," Colonel Martinez said. "We're dealing with a communication crisis that's affecting our entire Pacific network. Master Sergeant Rodriguez suggested you might have insights into the technical aspects of what we're seeing." Sarah studied the display screen, which showed a map of the Pacific region with red indicators marking installations that had lost communication. The pattern was more extensive than what she'd observed that morning, suggesting the situation was accelerating. She accessed her tablet and overlaid her own analysis on the official data being displayed. "Sir, based on my analysis, this appears to be a coordinated electronic warfare attack targeting our satellite communication networks," Sarah said. The pattern suggests systematic probing of our communication vulnerabilities, possibly as preparation for a larger operation. Colonel Martinez frowned. That's a serious assessment, Lieutenant. What makes you think this is coordinated rather than technical failure? Sarah activated her presentation mode and projected her analysis onto the main screen. Her data showed the timing, geographic distribution, and technical characteristics of the communication disruptions. The pattern was too precise to be accidental, too widespread to be random failure, and too sophisticated to be the work of minor adversaries. The disruptions are targeting specific frequency bands used by forward bases and isolated installations. Sarah explained. They're not affecting commercial satellites or civilian communications, which suggests technical knowledge of our military communication protocols. The timing indicates coordination across multiple time zones, requiring significant planning and resources. The implications of Sarah's analysis were sobering. If she was correct, U.S. military installations worldwide were being systematically isolated from their command structures. The attack was subtle enough to avoid triggering immediate military responses, but comprehensive enough to leave critical installations vulnerable to follow-up operations. Colonel Martinez studied Sarah's data with growing concern. Lieutenant, if your analysis is accurate, we could be facing a coordinated attack on our global communication infrastructure. What are the implications for our ability to coordinate responses? Sarah's response was immediate and precise. Sir, forward bases and isolated installations are becoming increasingly vulnerable as their communication links are severed. They're losing their ability to request support, coordinate with other units, or even report their status to higher command. If this continues, we could have hundreds of installations operating in isolation, unable to respond effectively to coordinated threats. The operations center fell silent as the implications sank in. The U.S. military's global effectiveness depended on its ability to coordinate operations across vast distances. If communication networks were systematically compromised, the military's distributed forces would become isolated and vulnerable to attack by adversaries who retained their coordination capabilities. Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached Sarah with a classified folder. Lieutenant, we've received reports from installations that are still in communication. Several forward bases are reporting unusual activity in their areas, but they can't coordinate responses because their communication links are failing. We need someone with your technical expertise to analyze these reports and determine if they're related to the communication disruptions. Sarah opened the folder and began reviewing the reports. The pattern that emerged was deeply troubling. Forward bases across the Pacific were reporting increased surveillance activity, unusual aircraft movements, and electronic signature detection that suggested hostile intelligence gathering. The reports were scattered and incomplete, but they painted a picture of coordinated preparation for military action. Her analysis revealed a sophisticated two-phase operation. The first phase involved systematically disrupting military communications to isolate U.S. installations. The second phase appeared to involve reconnaissance and preparation for attacks on the isolated bases. The enemy was using the communication disruption to mask their preparation for coordinated strikes against vulnerable installations. Sir, Sarah said, addressing Colonel Martinez, the reports suggest we're facing a coordinated attack plan. The communication disruptions are creating windows of vulnerability that hostile forces are exploiting for reconnaissance and preparation. If this pattern continues, we could face simultaneous attacks on multiple isolated installations. Colonel Martinez's expression hardened. What's our timeline, Lieutenant? How long before these isolated installations become completely vulnerable? Sarah consulted her analysis and made rapid calculations. Based on the rate of communication degradation and the pattern of hostile activity, I estimate we have less than 72 hours, before critical installations lose their ability to coordinate effective responses. After that, they'll be operating in isolation, vulnerable to coordinated attacks. The operations center erupted in activity as the implications became clear. Staff officers began contacting higher headquarters, trying to communicate the developing threat through the remaining communication channels. Communication technicians worked to establish backup networks and alternative communication methods. Everyone understood that they were facing a crisis that could fundamentally compromise U.S. military capabilities. But Sarah's analysis had revealed another troubling aspect of the situation. The attacks weren't just random strikes against military targets. They were specifically designed to test and exploit the vulnerabilities of the U.S. military's communication-dependent operational model. The enemy understood that disrupting communications would multiply the effectiveness of their attacks by preventing coordinated responses. Colonel Martinez called Sarah aside for a private discussion. "Lieutenant, your analysis suggests we're facing a sophisticated enemy with detailed knowledge of our communication systems and operational procedures. What kind of capabilities would be required to execute this type of attack?" Sarah's response was sobering. "Sir, this operation requires advanced electronic warfare capabilities, detailed intelligence about our communication networks, and the ability to coordinate operations across multiple time zones. It suggests a state-level adversary with significant resources and planning capabilities." The colonel nodded grimly. "That's what I was afraid of. Lieutenant, I need you to continue monitoring the situation and provide updates on the developing threat. Your technical expertise and analytical capabilities are critical to our understanding of what we're facing." As the day progressed, Sarah's analysis proved increasingly accurate. More installations lost communication, hostile activity increased around isolated bases, and the pattern of coordinated attack became undeniable. The U.S. military was facing a sophisticated threat that exploited the vulnerabilities of its communication-dependent operational model. Sarah spent the afternoon coordinating with communication technicians, analyzing intelligence reports, and refining her assessment of the developing threat. Her weekend warrior status became irrelevant as the crisis deepened. Her technical expertise and analytical capabilities were needed regardless of her part-time status. The evening briefing at Grayson was attended by senior officers from across the region, connected through the remaining communication channels. Sarah's analysis was presented to the group, providing the technical foundation for understanding the scope and implications of the coordinated attack on military communications. "The situation is deteriorating faster than initially projected," Sarah reported. "Communication degradation is accelerating, and hostile activity is increasing around isolated installations. We're facing a coordinated attack designed to exploit our communication vulnerabilities and overwhelm our ability to respond." General Harrison, the regional commander participating via secure video link, studied Sarah's data with obvious concern. "Lieutenant, your analysis suggests we're facing a coordinated attack on our global communication infrastructure. What are our options for maintaining operational effectiveness?" Sarah's response was immediate and precise. "Sir, we need to establish alternative communication networks and prepare for coordinated operations under degraded communication conditions. Some installations may need to operate independently while maintaining their defensive capabilities." The general nodded. "Lieutenant, I'm authorizing you to continue your analysis and provide recommendations for operational responses. Your technical expertise is critical to our understanding of this threat." As the briefing concluded, Sarah realized that her role had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just a weekend warrior participating in routine training exercises. She was a critical analyst providing essential intelligence about a coordinated attack on U.S. military capabilities. Her years of preparation and technical expertise had positioned her to play a crucial role in understanding and responding to the crisis. The operations center at Grayson remained active throughout the night as staff officers worked to maintain communication with isolated installations and coordinate responses to the developing threat. Sarah continued her analysis, monitoring the expansion of communication disruptions and the increase in hostile activity around vulnerable bases. Her technical expertise allowed her to identify patterns that others missed, providing critical insights into the enemy's capabilities and intentions. She worked through the night, analyzing intelligence reports, monitoring communication networks, and refining her assessment of the threat. By dawn, the situation had deteriorated further. More installations had lost communication, hostile activity had increased significantly, and the pattern of coordinated attack had become undeniable. The U.S. military was facing a sophisticated threat that required immediate and coordinated responses. Sarah's analysis had provided the technical foundation for understanding the crisis, but she knew that analysis alone wouldn't be sufficient. The isolated installations needed support, and the degraded communication networks were preventing effective coordination of that support. Someone would need to fly into the developing crisis, maintaining communication links and coordinating responses under conditions that challenged the capabilities of even the most experienced pilots. As she reviewed the latest intelligence reports, Sarah realized that her years of preparation might finally be tested. The crisis was developing in ways that required exactly the type of extended, high-risk flight operations she had trained for in countless simulation sessions. The weekend warrior who had prepared for impossible scenarios might finally face the impossible mission she had always anticipated. The morning briefing would determine the military's response to the crisis, but Sarah already knew that conventional approaches wouldn't be sufficient. The situation required capabilities that went beyond normal operational parameters, skills that had been developed through years of intensive preparation, and a level of commitment that exceeded standard military requirements. She was ready for whatever challenge might come, but she also understood that readiness alone wouldn't be sufficient. The mission would require execution under conditions that tested every aspect of her preparation, and the stakes would be higher than anything she had ever faced. The weekend warrior was about to discover whether her years of preparation had truly prepared her for the impossible. The secure phone in Sarah's apartment rang at 0213 hours on Thursday morning, its shrill tone cutting through the darkness with an urgency that made her instantly alert. The caller ID showed Colonel Martinez's direct line, and his voice carried a tension she had never heard before. "Lieutenant Chun, we need you at the base immediately. Full flight gear. This is not a drill." Sarah was dressed and driving toward Grayson within 12 minutes, her mind racing through the possibilities. The communication crisis had worsened overnight, and intelligence reports suggested that hostile forces were moving into position around isolated installations. The coordinated attack she had predicted was transitioning from preparation to execution. Base was operating under blackout conditions when she arrived, with only essential lighting visible and all non-critical personnel restricted to quarters. The operations center hummed with urgent activity as staff officers coordinated responses to a crisis that was unfolding faster than anyone had anticipated. Colonel Martinez met her at the entrance to the operations center, his expression grim. "Lieutenant, the situation has deteriorated beyond our worst projections. We've lost contact with Forward Operating Base Kestrel in the Alaska wilderness. They were scheduled to report in 6 hours ago, and all attempts to establish communication have failed." Sarah followed him to the main display screen, which showed a map of Alaska with a red indicator marking the location of FOB Kestrel. The base was situated in a remote valley, accessible only by air and surrounded by hundreds of miles of wilderness. Under normal circumstances, the isolation provided security. Under current conditions, it had become a death trap. "Sir, what was their last reported status?" Sarah asked, studying the tactical display. They reported unusual aircraft activity at 1800 hours yesterday, then went silent during their scheduled communication window at 0200 this morning, Colonel Martinez replied. Weather conditions in the area are deteriorating rapidly, with a major storm system moving in from the northwest. We estimate they have less than 24 hours before they're completely cut off. Sarah accessed her tablet and pulled up the meteorological data for the region. The storm system was massive, with wind speeds exceeding 80 knots and visibility dropping to near zero. The weather window for flight operations was closing rapidly, and once the storm hit, no aircraft would be able to reach the isolated base. "Sir, what's the complement at FOB Kestrel?" she asked. 43 personnel, including a mobile communications unit, a medical team, and a specialized intelligence detachment, Colonel Martinez replied. They're equipped for extended operations, but not for siege conditions. If they're under attack, they won't be able to hold out indefinitely. The implications were staggering. FOB Kestrel housed critical intelligence assets and communication equipment that couldn't be allowed to fall into hostile hands. The personnel stationed there were highly trained specialists whose capture would compromise numerous ongoing operations. The base had to be reached, regardless of the conditions. Major Williams, the senior operations officer, approached with a folder of flight plans. "Sir, we've analyzed all possible approaches to FOB Kestrel. The weather conditions eliminate conventional flight operations. The storm system is too extensive to fly around, and the terrain prevents low-altitude approaches." Sarah studied the flight plans, recognizing the limitations that had defeated every conventional approach. The weather system extended for hundreds of miles, the terrain was mountainous and unforgiving, and the communication blackout meant that any rescue mission would be operating without ground support or navigation assistance. What about the C-130 capabilities in extreme weather? Sarah asked. Major Williams shook his head. The weather conditions exceed the aircraft's certified operating parameters. Wind speeds are too high, visibility is too low, and the terrain prevents safe approaches to the base. No pilot would attempt that mission under these conditions. But Sarah's mind was already working through alternatives that others hadn't considered. Her years of studying extreme weather operations and analyzing aircraft performance under adverse conditions had given her insights that went beyond standard operating procedures. She understood the Ki-130's true capabilities, not just its certified limitations. "Sir, I need to review the detailed meteorological data and terrain analysis," she said. "There might be approaches that haven't been considered." Colonel Martinez nodded. "Lieutenant, you have full access to all intelligence and meteorological data. If there's a way to reach FOB Kestrel, we need to find it." Sarah spent the next 2 hours analyzing every aspect of the mission parameters. The weather data revealed brief windows of slightly reduced wind speed that occurred in predictable patterns. The terrain analysis showed narrow valleys that could provide limited protection from the worst weather conditions. The intelligence reports indicated that hostile forces were already moving toward FOB Kestrel's location. Her analysis revealed a possible approach that would require precise timing, exceptional piloting skills, and the ability to operate under conditions that exceeded normal safety parameters. The mission would require flying through the storm system using terrain masking, navigating by instruments alone, and landing at a remote base without ground support or communication assistance. "Sir," Sarah said, addressing Colonel Martinez, "I've identified a possible approach to FOB Kestrel. It would require flying through the storm system using valley navigation, timing the approach to coincide with temporary weather windows, and accepting risk levels that exceed normal operational parameters." Colonel Martinez studied her analysis with growing concern. "Lieutenant, this approach would require piloting skills that exceed standard requirements. The weather conditions are beyond anything our pilots have trained for, and the terrain navigation would be extremely challenging, even under normal circumstances. Sarah nodded. Sir, the mission parameters exceed normal training requirements, but they're within the theoretical capabilities of the C-130 if flown by someone with extensive extreme weather experience and detailed knowledge of the aircraft's performance characteristics. The operations center fell silent as the implications became clear. The mission was possible, but it would require a pilot with capabilities that went far beyond standard training. The weather conditions, terrain challenges, and navigation requirements created a combination of factors that would test every aspect of a pilot's skills and knowledge. Major Williams reviewed Sarah's analysis with obvious skepticism. Lieutenant, this approach would require someone with extensive experience in extreme weather operations, detailed knowledge of terrain navigation, and the ability to operate under conditions that most pilots have never encountered. Do we have anyone with those qualifications? Sarah's response was quiet but confident. Sir, I have those qualifications. I've spent years training for exactly this type of mission, studying extreme weather operations and analyzing aircraft performance under adverse conditions. I've prepared for scenarios that match these mission parameters. The operations center erupted in discussion as officers debated the feasibility of Sarah's proposal. Her weekend warrior status became the focus of intense scrutiny, with some officers questioning whether a part-time pilot could handle a mission that exceeded the capabilities of full-time professionals. Colonel Martinez called for silence. Lieutenant Chun, you're proposing to fly a mission that our most experienced pilots consider impossible. You're a weekend warrior with excellent training records, but this mission would challenge the capabilities of pilots with decades of experience. Sarah's response was immediate and precise. Sir, I've prepared specifically for this type of mission. My training has focused on extreme weather operations, terrain navigation, and aircraft performance under adverse conditions. I've studied every aspect of C-130 capabilities and developed techniques that go beyond standard procedures. General Harrison joined the discussion via secure video link, his expression serious. Lieutenant, the mission you're describing would require exceptional piloting skills, detailed knowledge of extreme weather operations, and the ability to make critical decisions under unprecedented conditions. What makes you think you can succeed where other pilots would fail? Sarah activated her presentation system and displayed her training records, showing thousands of hours of simulation time focused on extreme weather operations, terrain navigation, and emergency procedures. Her preparation had been systematic and comprehensive, covering every aspect of the mission she was now proposing. Sir, I've trained for this exact scenario for years, she said. My preparation has focused on missions that exceed standard parameters, using techniques that aren't taught in conventional training programs. I've studied aircraft performance under extreme conditions and developed navigation methods that don't rely on standard support systems. The general studied her data with growing interest. Lieutenant, your training records show exceptional preparation for extreme conditions. However, training and real-world execution are different things. This mission would have no margin for error, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Sarah nodded. Sir, I understand the risks and responsibilities. I've prepared for this mission because I believe that someday, someone would need a pilot who could operate under impossible conditions. That day has arrived, and I'm ready to accept the challenge. The discussion continued for another hour as senior officers evaluated Sarah's proposal and assessed the alternatives. The weather window was closing rapidly, and the situation at Phobe Kestrel was deteriorating. If a rescue mission was going to be attempted, it would have to launch within the next few hours. Colonel Martinez made the final decision. Lieutenant Chun, you're authorized to proceed with mission preparation. We'll provide full support for your operation, but the execution will be your responsibility. Are you prepared to accept those terms? Sarah's response was immediate. Yes, sir. I'm prepared to execute this mission and accept full responsibility for the outcome. The operations center transformed into a mission planning hub as staff officers worked to support Sarah's operation. Weather specialists provided detailed forecasts. Intelligence officers briefed her on the situation at FOB Kestrel, and logistics personnel prepared the aircraft for the mission. Sarah's C-130 tail number 847 was moved to the primary hangar for mission preparation. The aircraft was equipped with specialized navigation equipment, extended-range fuel tanks, and communication systems that could operate under adverse conditions. Every system was checked and rechecked, ensuring that the aircraft would perform flawlessly under the extreme conditions it would face. Master Sergeant Rodriguez supervised the aircraft preparation, his expression showing both confidence and concern. Lieutenant, this aircraft is in perfect condition, and I've personally verified every system. But the conditions you'll be flying in will test every component beyond normal parameters. Sarah nodded. Sergeant, I know the risks, and I appreciate your preparation. This aircraft has been my partner for years, and I trust it completely. The pre-flight briefing covered every aspect of the mission, from the detailed weather analysis to the terrain navigation requirements. Sarah's approach would require flying through the storm system, using visual references when possible, and instrument navigation when necessary. The timing would have to be perfect, and there would be no opportunity for second attempts. Lieutenant, Colonel Martinez said during the final briefing, this mission exceeds everything we've asked of our pilots. You'll be operating alone, under conditions that challenge the limits of aircraft performance, with no backup support or communication assistance. Are you certain you're prepared for this challenge? Sarah's response was calm and confident. Sir, I've prepared for this mission my entire career. I understand the risks and responsibilities, and I'm ready to execute the operation. The hangar doors opened as Sarah conducted her final pre-flight inspection. The weather outside was already deteriorating, with wind gusts and reduced visibility that would have grounded normal operations. But Sarah's mission was anything but normal, and conventional limitations no longer applied. She climbed into the cockpit of the C-130, her hands moving across the controls with practiced precision. The aircraft's systems responded perfectly, confirming that every component was ready for the challenging mission ahead. The weather radar showed the massive storm system approaching. With the eye of the storm still hours away, Sarah's final communication with the operations center was brief and professional. Control, this is Lieutenant Chun, ready for departure. Mission parameters understood and accepted. Proceeding to FOB Kestrel. The response came immediately. Lieutenant Chun, you are cleared for departure. All personnel depend on your success. Good luck. As the C-130 lifted off from Grayson Air National Guard Base, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The mission she was undertaking would test every aspect of her preparation, challenge her skills beyond anything she had experienced, and determine the fate of 43 isolated personnel. The weekend warrior who had prepared for impossible scenarios was finally facing the impossible mission. The next 72 hours would determine whether years of preparation had truly prepared her for the ultimate test of her capabilities. The storm ahead was more than weather. It was the crucible that would transform her from a part-time pilot into something else entirely. Behind her, the lights of Grayson faded into the darkness as she flew toward a storm that would test everything she had learned, everything she had prepared for, and everything she believed about her own capabilities. The rescue mission had begun, and there was no turning back. The first indication that Sarah had entered something beyond normal weather conditions came 30 minutes into the flight, when the C-130 encountered turbulence that felt like the aircraft was being shaken by an invisible giant. The instrument panel flickered momentarily as electrical systems strained against the electromagnetic interference generated by the massive storm system. Ahead, Sarah's hands remained steady on the controls as she adjusted the aircraft's trim to compensate for the increasingly violent air currents. The weather radar showed a solid wall of red and purple, indicating precipitation and wind speeds that exceeded the display's measurement capabilities. She was flying into the heart of one of the most severe weather systems recorded in the region's history. The communication radio crackled with static as atmospheric interference disrupted the signal from Grayson. Colonel Martinez's voice came through in broken fragments. Lieutenant Chun. Weather conditions ... recommend ... abort. The transmission dissolved into white noise as the storm's electrical activity overwhelmed the communication frequencies. Sarah switched to the backup communication system, but the interference was too severe for reliable contact with the base. She was now operating under the conditions she had anticipated, alone, without ground support, navigating through a storm system that challenged every aspect of her preparation and the aircraft's capabilities. The GPS navigation system began showing error messages as the storm's electromagnetic effects interfered with satellite signals. Sarah had expected this and immediately switched to the inertial navigation system she had installed and calibrated specifically for conditions where electronic navigation would be unreliable. The system used gyroscopes and accelerometers to track the aircraft's position based on its movement from the known starting point, but even the inertial system had limitations in extreme conditions. The violent turbulence was affecting the gyroscope's accuracy, and the constant course corrections required to maintain stability were introducing cumulative errors into the navigation calculations. Sarah would have to rely increasingly on terrain features and dead reckoning navigation as the flight progressed. The first real test of her preparation came when the aircraft encountered a downdraft that dropped the C-130 nearly 2,000 feet in less than 30 seconds. The sudden descent triggered multiple warning systems as the aircraft's altitude plummeted toward the mountains below. Sarah's response was immediate and instinctive, adding power and adjusting the aircraft's attitude to arrest the descent and regain controlled flight. The recovery maneuver required precise control inputs that she had practiced thousands of times in simulation but never experienced in reality. The aircraft's response was sluggish in the dense, turbulent air, and Sarah had to compensate for the delayed reactions while maintaining awareness of the terrain below. The margin for error was measured in seconds and feet, with no room for hesitation or uncertainty. As the C-130 climbed back to a safe altitude, Sarah realized that the storm was more severe than even her most pessimistic projections had predicted. The weather conditions were challenging her skills and the aircraft's capabilities in ways that required constant adaptation and split-second decision-making. She was operating at the edge of what was possible, where small mistakes could have catastrophic consequences. The terrain below was invisible through the cloud cover, but Sarah's mental map of the region allowed her to navigate using her understanding of the landscape rather than visual references. She had studied the topography for hundreds of hours, memorizing the location of every mountain peak, valley, and ridge that could affect her flight path. This knowledge now became critical as she flew through conditions where traditional navigation methods were failing. The storm's intensity continued to increase as Sarah penetrated deeper into the system. Ice began forming on the aircraft's wings and control surfaces, affecting the aerodynamic characteristics and requiring constant adjustments to maintain stable flight. The de-icing systems were operating at maximum capacity, but the accumulation rate was challenging their effectiveness. Sarah activated the pneumatic de-icing boots that expanded and contracted to break ice formations on the wing surfaces. The system worked effectively, but the process consumed significant electrical power and placed additional strain on the aircraft systems. She had to balance the need to prevent ice accumulation with the requirement to conserve power for the critical systems needed for navigation and communication. The fuel consumption rate was higher than calculated due to the constant maneuvering required to maintain stable flight in the turbulent conditions. Sarah recalculated her fuel requirements and realized that the margin for error was smaller than anticipated. She would have enough fuel to reach FOB Castro and return to base, but only if the flight proceeded without significant delays or deviations. 2 hours into the flight, Sarah encountered the most challenging aspect of the storm, a series of rotating wind patterns that created localized areas of extreme turbulence. These microbursts and wind shears were invisible to radar, but could destroy an aircraft in seconds if not properly managed. Sarah's experience with extreme weather operations allowed her to recognize the signs and adjust her flight path to avoid the most dangerous areas. The technique required flying at lower altitudes, where the terrain provided some protection from the worst wind patterns, but this approach increased the risk of collision with mountains hidden by cloud cover. Sarah used her detailed knowledge of the terrain to navigate through valleys and passes that offered relatively safe passage while remaining below the altitude where the wind shears were most severe. Her preparation for this type of navigation proved crucial as she flew through mountain passes using only instrument readings and her mental map of the terrain. The margins were tight, with clearance measured in hundreds of feet rather than the thousands normally required for safe flight. Every course correction had to be precise, and every altitude change had to account for the terrain below. The communication systems continued to malfunction as the storm's electrical activity intensified. Sarah attempted to contact FOB Kestrel using emergency frequencies, but the interference was too severe for reliable communication. She was approaching the target area with no knowledge of the situation on the ground and no way to coordinate her arrival with the personnel at the base. Uncertainty about conditions at FOB Kestrel added another layer of complexity to the mission. Sarah didn't know if the base was under attack, if the runway was clear, or if there were hostile forces in the area. She would have to assess the situation visually and make critical decisions about landing and evacuation without ground support or communication assistance. As the C-130 approached the general area of FOB Kestrel, Sarah began her descent through the cloud cover to assess the situation below. The descent was challenging because the clouds extended almost to ground level, providing minimal visibility for evaluating the terrain and landing conditions. She had to rely on her instruments and knowledge of the base's location to guide the approach. The first glimpse of the ground came at 800 feet above the valley floor, when the aircraft broke through the lowest cloud layer. Sarah immediately saw that the situation was worse than anticipated. The base was partially obscured by smoke, and there were signs of recent combat activity around the perimeter. Vehicles and equipment were scattered in defensive positions, indicating that the base was under siege. Sarah's tactical training immediately took over as she assessed the ground situation. The runway appeared to be clear, but there were indications of hostile forces in the surrounding area. She would have to land quickly, load the personnel, and depart before the aircraft became a target for enemy fire. The mission had transitioned from a rescue operation to a combat evacuation under hostile conditions. The approach to the runway required flying through small arms, fire from hostile forces positioned in the hills surrounding the base. Sarah could see muzzle flashes and tracer rounds as she lined up for landing, but the poor visibility and difficult weather conditions made accurate targeting nearly impossible for the ground forces. She used the terrain and weather to mask her approach, making the aircraft a difficult target. The landing was the most challenging aspect of the mission, requiring precise control inputs while under fire and in severe weather conditions. The crosswinds from the storm system made the approach unstable, and Sarah had to make constant corrections to maintain alignment with the runway. The aircraft touched down hard but safely, with the runway surface providing adequate friction. Despite the wet conditions, as the C-130 rolled to a stop, Sarah could see personnel from FOB Kestrel running toward the aircraft from defensive positions around the base. The evacuation would have to be conducted quickly and efficiently, with no time for extended loading procedures. She kept the engines running at flight idle, ready for immediate departure once the personnel were aboard. The loading process was coordinated by the base's senior officer, who had maintained discipline and organization despite the siege conditions. The personnel moved in organized groups, carrying essential equipment and classified materials that couldn't be left behind. Sarah monitored the weather conditions and assessed the tactical situation while the evacuation proceeded. The hostile forces around the base began concentrating their fire on the aircraft as they realized that an evacuation was in progress. Sarah could hear small arms fire impacting the aircraft's fuselage, but the C-130's robust construction provided protection against most ground fire. She prepared for immediate departure as soon as the last personnel were aboard. The final group of evacuees included wounded personnel who required medical attention during the flight. Sarah's aircraft was equipped with basic medical supplies, and several of the evacuated personnel were trained medics who could provide care during the return flight. The medical situation added another layer of complexity to the mission, requiring smooth flight conditions to prevent further injury to the wounded. As the last personnel boarded the aircraft, Sarah received word that the evacuation was complete. All 43 personnel from FOB Kestrel were aboard, along with critical equipment and classified materials. The mission had been successful, but the most challenging part was still ahead. Flying back through the storm system while carrying a full load of passengers and equipment. The takeoff from FOB Kestrel was conducted under fire, with hostile forces attempting to prevent the aircraft's departure. Sarah used maximum power settings and aggressive maneuvering to clear the valley quickly, climbing into the cloud cover where the aircraft would be protected from ground fire. The overloaded aircraft responded sluggishly, but the C-130's powerful engines provided adequate performance for the escape. Once clear of the immediate threat, Sarah faced the challenge of navigating back through the storm system while carrying nearly double the normal passenger load. The additional weight affected the aircraft's performance characteristics, requiring adjustments to the flight techniques she had used during the inbound flight. The fuel consumption rate was higher due to the increased weight, reducing the margin for error even further. The return flight would test every aspect of Sarah's preparation and the aircraft's capabilities. She had successfully completed the most difficult part of the mission, but the challenge of bringing 43 people safely home through one of the most severe storms in the region's history was still ahead. The weekend warrior had proven that she could reach the impossible target. Now she had to prove that she could bring everyone back alive. The storm was intensifying as the heavily loaded C-130 climbed into the turbulent air that had nearly destroyed the aircraft during the inbound flight. Sarah's hands tightened on the controls as she prepared for the most challenging test of her flying career. The rescue had been successful, but the mission wouldn't be complete until everyone was safely on the ground at Grayson Air National Guard Base. The heavily loaded C-130 shuddered as it climbed through the turbulent air above FOB Kestrel. Each gust of wind testing the aircraft's structural limits with 43 additional souls aboard. Sarah felt the difference immediately. The controls responded sluggishly. The climb rate had decreased significantly, and every maneuver required more time and space to execute safely. Staff Sergeant Jessica Torres, the senior medic from FOB Kestrel, made her way forward to the cockpit as the aircraft leveled off in the storm clouds. Her face was etched with concern as she shouted over the engine noise, "Lieutenant, we have 3 critical casualties back there. 2 with internal injuries and 1 with severe blood loss. They need immediate medical attention, and this turbulence is making treatment nearly impossible. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. The wounded personnel needed smooth flight conditions to prevent further injury, but the storm system offered no respite from the violent turbulence. She would have to find a way to minimize the aircraft's motion while still maintaining control in conditions that were challenging even for an unloaded aircraft. "Sergeant, I'm going to try to find smoother air at a different altitude," Sarah replied. "Secure everyone as best you can. This is going to be a rough ride, but I'll do everything possible to minimize the turbulence." The fuel situation had become critical with the additional weight and the extended time in the storm system. Sarah's calculations showed that fuel consumption was 30% higher than projected, leaving minimal reserves for the return flight. Any significant deviations from the planned route or delays in reaching base would exhaust the fuel supply before they could land safely. As the aircraft climbed to seek smoother air, Sarah encountered a new challenge: severe icing conditions that threatened to overwhelm the de-icing systems. The ice accumulation rate was exceeding the capabilities of the pneumatic boots, and the weight of the ice was further degrading the aircraft's performance. The situation was approaching the point where the aircraft might become uncontrollable. Sarah activated the emergency de-icing procedures, diverting power from non-essential systems to maximize the effectiveness of the ice removal equipment. The cabin lights dimmed as electrical power was redirected, and some of the navigation equipment shut down to conserve energy for the critical flight systems. The aircraft's performance continued to deteriorate as ice accumulated on surfaces that weren't protected by the de-icing systems. Sarah could feel the controls becoming less responsive, and the aircraft's stall speed was increasing as the ice disrupted the airflow over the wings. She had to maintain higher airspeeds to prevent the aircraft from stalling, but the increased speed was consuming fuel at an even faster rate. 20 minutes into the return flight, the situation in the cargo compartment became critical. Sergeant Torres reported that one of the wounded personnel was going into shock and needed immediate medical intervention. The turbulence was preventing effective treatment, and the patient's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Sarah made a decision that defied conventional aviation wisdom. She began a controlled descent into the lower altitudes, where the turbulence was more severe, but the air was warmer and would reduce the icing problems. The trade-off was dangerous. The lower altitude would expose the aircraft to more violent turbulence, but it might provide the stable conditions needed for medical treatment. The descent through the storm layers was harrowing. The aircraft encountered downdrafts that pushed it toward the mountains below, and updrafts that slammed everyone aboard against the cabin ceiling. Sarah's skill in reading the storm patterns allowed her to find brief pockets of relatively calm air, but these respites were short-lived and separated by violent turbulence. At 8,000 feet, the aircraft broke through a layer of particularly dense clouds and encountered a phenomenon that Sarah had studied but never experienced: a mesocyclone, a rotating column of air that could tear an aircraft apart in seconds. The C-130 was caught in the edge of the rotation, and Sarah had to execute a series of aggressive maneuvers to escape the dangerous airflow. The escape from the mesocyclone required banking the aircraft at angles that stressed the structure beyond normal limits. Sarah could hear the airframe groaning under the strain, and warning lights illuminated across the instrument panel as various systems approached their operational limits. But the maneuver was successful, and the aircraft cleared the dangerous area without suffering catastrophic damage. The medical situation in the cargo compartment had stabilized temporarily, but Sergeant Torres reported that the wounded personnel needed to reach medical facilities within the next hour to survive. The nearest hospital was at Grayson Air National Guard Base, still more than 200 miles away through the heart of the storm system. Sarah pushed the aircraft to its maximum sustainable speed while still maintaining control in the turbulent conditions. The engines were operating at high power settings that consumed fuel rapidly, but the need to reach medical facilities quickly outweighed the fuel concerns. She calculated that they had enough fuel to reach base if everything went according to plan. But there was no margin for error. The navigation systems continued to malfunction as the storm's electrical activity intensified. Sarah was flying primarily by dead reckoning, using her knowledge of the terrain and her understanding of the storm's movement to maintain course toward Grayson. The technique required constant mental calculations and adjustments based on wind, drift, and compass variations. 30 minutes into the return flight, Sarah encountered the most dangerous aspect of the storm, a series of tornadoes that had formed in the lower atmosphere. The radar showed multiple rotating cells ahead, each capable of destroying the aircraft if encountered directly. She had to navigate around these dangerous areas while maintaining course toward base. The detour around the tornado cells added critical minutes to the flight time and consumed additional fuel. Sarah recalculated her fuel requirements and realized that the situation had become desperate. They had enough fuel to reach Grayson if the flight proceeded without further delays, but any additional complications would exhaust the fuel supply before they could land. As the aircraft approached the halfway point of the return flight, Sarah received an unexpected communication through the static-filled radio. Colonel Martinez's voice came through in broken fragments. "Lieutenant Chun. Weather conditions at base. Runway visibility. Emergency equipment standing by." Sarah tried to respond, but the transmission was too fragmented to understand completely. She gathered that weather conditions at Grayson were also deteriorating, and that the base was preparing for an emergency landing. The situation was becoming more complex as multiple challenges converged. Simultaneously, the storm system had expanded beyond its predicted boundaries, and the weather conditions at Grayson were now approaching the same severity as those encountered during the outbound flight. Sarah realized that even reaching the base wouldn't guarantee a successful landing if the runway conditions were too severe for safe operations. 40 minutes into the return flight, the aircraft encountered a new challenge: severe clear air turbulence that was invisible to radar, but capable of causing structural damage to the aircraft. The turbulence struck without warning, throwing the heavily loaded C-130 into violent oscillations that stressed the airframe beyond design limits. Sarah's response was immediate and instinctive, reducing power and adjusting the aircraft's attitude to minimize the structural stress. The maneuver was successful, but the encounter had shaken everyone aboard and highlighted the continuing danger of the flight. The aircraft was approaching the limits of its structural capabilities, and any additional stress could cause catastrophic failure. The medical situation in the cargo compartment had become critical again. Sergeant Torres reported that 2 of the wounded personnel were in severe distress and needed immediate medical attention. The turbulence was preventing effective treatment, and their conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Sarah made another dangerous decision: descending to an altitude where the air was smoother, but where the terrain clearance was minimal. The lower altitude provided better conditions for medical treatment, but it increased the risk of collision with mountains that were hidden by cloud cover. She was operating at the edge of what was safe, balancing multiple life-threatening risks simultaneously. The fuel situation had become desperate. Sarah's calculations showed that they had enough fuel to reach Grayson if the current consumption rate continued, but any further delays or complications would exhaust the fuel supply before landing. She was operating with no margin for error, where every decision could mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure. As the aircraft approached the final 100 miles to Grayson, Sarah began receiving clearer communications from the base. The weather conditions were severe, with crosswinds approaching the aircraft's landing limits and visibility reduced to near zero. The base was preparing for an emergency landing, but the conditions were challenging even for normal operations. Sarah's Response was characteristic of her preparation and determination. She began calculating approach profiles for landing in extreme weather conditions, using techniques she had practiced in simulation but never executed in reality. The landing would require precision that exceeded normal requirements, with no margin for error in weather conditions that challenged the aircraft's capabilities. The final approach to Grayson would be conducted in weather conditions that would have prevented most aircraft from attempting to land. Sarah's years of preparation for extreme weather operations had anticipated this scenario, and she had developed techniques for landing in conditions that exceeded normal operational limits. As the aircraft began its descent toward Grayson Air National Guard Base, Sarah knew that the most challenging aspect of the mission was still ahead. She had successfully evacuated 43 personnel from FOB Kestrel and navigated through one of the most severe storm systems in the region's history. But the mission wouldn't be complete until everyone was safely on the ground. The wounded personnel in the cargo compartment were fighting for their lives, dependent on Sarah's ability to land safely in conditions that challenged every aspect of her training and preparation. The fuel gauges showed dangerously low levels, and the weather conditions at Grayson were approaching the limits of what was possible for safe landing operations. Sarah's hands remained steady on the controls as the heavily loaded C-130 descended through the storm toward the runway lights of Grayson Air National Guard Base. The weekend warrior who had prepared for impossible scenarios was about to face the ultimate test of her capabilities. The lives of 43 people depended on her ability to land safely in conditions that exceeded every normal operational parameter. The approach lights appeared through the storm as Sarah lined up for what would be the most challenging landing of her career. The aircraft was heavy, the weather was severe, and the fuel was nearly exhausted. But she was ready for this moment, prepared by years of training that had anticipated exactly this scenario. The impossible mission was about to reach its conclusion, and Sarah was determined to bring everyone home safely. The runway lights of Grayson Air National Guard Base appeared through the storm like distant stars, flickering and wavering in the turbulent air that made the final approach one of the most dangerous phases of the entire mission. Sarah's fuel gauges showed levels so low that the warning lights had been illuminated for the past 20 minutes, indicating that engine failure from fuel starvation was imminent. The control tower's voice crackled through the static-filled radio with urgent instructions. Lieutenant Chun, winds are gusting to 55 knots with severe crosswind components. Visibility is 200 feet with heavy precipitation. We have emergency equipment standing by, but conditions are at the absolute limits for landing operations. Sarah's response was calm, despite the desperate situation. Tower, I understand the conditions. I'm committed to this approach. Have medical personnel ready for immediate evacuation of wounded personnel. The heavily loaded C-130 wallowed through the turbulent air as Sarah fought to maintain control during the approach. The aircraft's response to control inputs was sluggish, due to the weight of 43 passengers and the severe weather conditions. Every gust of wind threatened to push the aircraft off the narrow corridor that led to the runway. At 500 feet above the runway, Sarah encountered the most violent turbulence of the entire flight. The aircraft dropped suddenly, falling nearly 100 feet in seconds before she could arrest the descent. The passengers in the cargo compartment were thrown against the ceiling and bulkheads, and several of the wounded personnel cried out in pain as the violent motion aggravated their injuries. Sergeant Torres struggled to maintain her position beside the most critically wounded patient as the aircraft bucked and rolled through the turbulent air. Lieutenant, we're losing him back here. The turbulence is causing internal bleeding to worsen. We need to get on the ground immediately. Sarah's training in extreme weather landings guided her response. She reduced power and configured the aircraft for a steeper approach angle, trading altitude for airspeed control in the gusty conditions. The technique was dangerous with a heavily loaded aircraft, but it provided better control authority in the crosswind conditions that were pushing the aircraft toward the edge of the runway. The approach required constant corrections as wind gusts from different directions struck the aircraft in rapid succession. Sarah's hands moved continuously on the controls, making small adjustments to maintain alignment with the runway centerline. The aircraft's response was delayed due to the heavy weight, requiring her to anticipate the wind effects and make control inputs before the aircraft began to drift off course. At 200 feet above the runway, the aircraft encountered a severe downdraft that pushed it below the normal glide path. Sarah added power to arrest the descent, but the engine's response was sluggish due to the high altitude and extreme weather conditions. The aircraft continued to sink toward the approach lights, and Sarah realized that a normal landing might not be possible. Her decision was instantaneous and based on techniques she had practiced in simulation but never used in reality. Instead of executing a standard flare at the normal height, she allowed the aircraft to descend rapidly toward the runway while maintaining forward speed. The technique would result in a hard landing, but it would ensure that the aircraft reached the runway surface before the fuel was exhausted. The C-130 struck the runway with tremendous force, the landing gear absorbing the impact with a sound like thunder. The aircraft bounced twice before settling onto the runway surface, the tires screaming against the wet pavement as Sarah applied maximum braking. The reversal of the propeller pitch added to the deceleration, creating a wall of sound and spray as the aircraft fought to stop within the available runway length. Emergency vehicles raced alongside the aircraft as it rolled down the runway, their flashing lights creating a surreal scene in the storm-darkened conditions. Sarah could see fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue vehicles positioning themselves for immediate response if the aircraft experienced mechanical failure during the landing roll. The aircraft came to a stop with less than 500 feet of runway remaining, the brakes smoking and the tires showing signs of severe stress from the extreme landing conditions. Sarah shut down the engines immediately to prevent fire from the overheated brakes, and the sudden silence was broken only by the sound of rain drumming against the aircraft's fuselage. The cargo door opened before the aircraft had completely stopped, and medical personnel rushed aboard to evacuate the wounded. Sergeant Torres directed the evacuation with professional efficiency, ensuring that the most critically injured personnel were removed first and transported to the base hospital. The scene was organized chaos as medical teams worked to stabilize patients while evacuation procedures continued. Sarah remained at the controls, monitoring the aircraft systems and coordinating with ground personnel. The fuel gauges showed that the tanks were virtually empty, confirming that the aircraft had been operating on fumes during the final approach. The mission had been completed with literally no fuel remaining, demonstrating the precision of her fuel management calculations. Colonel Martinez appeared at the cockpit door, his face showing relief and amazement at the successful completion of the mission. "Lieutenant Chun, that was the most incredible display of flying I've ever witnessed. You've accomplished something that our most experienced pilots considered impossible." Sarah's response was characteristic of her approach to the mission. "Sir, the mission was successful because of the preparation and the capabilities of this aircraft. The personnel from FOB Kestrel are safe, and that's what matters." The evacuation of the 43 personnel from FOB Kestrel was completed within 30 minutes of landing. The wounded were transported to the base hospital, where emergency medical teams worked to stabilize their conditions. The remaining personnel were taken to debriefing facilities where intelligence officers began the process of analyzing the situation at the forward base. Master Sergeant Rodriguez supervised the post-flight inspection of the aircraft, documenting the stress and damage that had resulted from the extreme mission conditions. The C-130 had performed beyond its normal operational limits, and the inspection revealed multiple systems that had operated at maximum capacity throughout the flight. "Lieutenant, Master Sergeant Rodriguez said as he reviewed the inspection. Results: this aircraft has been pushed beyond anything I've seen in 20 years of maintenance. The fact that it brought everyone home safely is a testament to both the aircraft's design and your flying skills. The weather conditions at Grayson continued to deteriorate throughout the night, confirming that Sarah's timing had been critical to the mission's success. The storm system had expanded beyond its predicted boundaries, and no other aircraft would have been able to reach FOB, Kestrel, or return safely under the conditions that had prevailed during the mission. The intelligence debriefing of the FOB Kestrel personnel revealed the extent of the coordinated attack on U.S. military installations. The base had been under siege for more than 18 hours, with hostile forces systematically testing the defenses and preparing for a major assault. The evacuation had been completed just hours before the base's position would have become untenable. Major Thompson, the commanding officer of FOB Kestrel, provided a detailed account of the siege conditions during his debriefing. The hostile forces had surrounded the base with sophisticated equipment and coordinated tactics. They were jamming our communications and had positioned anti-aircraft weapons to prevent evacuation. Lieutenant Chun's arrival during the storm was the only thing that saved us. The strategic implications of the mission became clear as intelligence. Analysts processed the information gathered from the evacuated personnel. The coordinated attack on military communications and the siege of FOB Kestrel were part of a larger operation designed to test U.S. military responses and identify vulnerabilities in the defense network. Sarah's successful evacuation of FOB Kestrel had disrupted the enemy's operational timeline and prevented the capture of critical intelligence assets. The mission had strategic significance beyond the rescue of 43 personnel, contributing to the broader defense against the coordinated attack on military installations. The medical teams at Grayson worked throughout the night to treat the wounded personnel evacuated from FOB Kestrel. The 3 most critically injured patients required immediate surgery, and their survival depended on the rapid evacuation that Sarah had accomplished. The medical staff confirmed that delays of even 30 minutes would have resulted in fatal outcomes. Dr. Patricia Williams, the chief medical officer at Grayson, summarized the medical situation during the post-mission briefing. The wounded personnel from FOB Kestrel received life-saving treatment because of Lieutenant Chen's ability to evacuate them under impossible conditions. The turbulence during the flight was severe, but her flying skills minimized the additional trauma that could have been fatal. The fuel analysis of the C-13 confirmed the precision of Sarah's fuel management during the mission. The aircraft had landed with less than 15 minutes of fuel remaining, indicating that the mission had been completed with minimal margin for error. The analysis demonstrated the accuracy of her calculations and the effectiveness of her fuel conservation techniques. The post-mission analysis revealed that Sarah had accomplished something unprecedented in military aviation history. She had successfully completed a combat evacuation under weather conditions that exceeded all normal operational parameters, using techniques that had never been tested in real-world conditions. The mission had required skills and knowledge that went far beyond standard training requirements. General Harrison participated in the post-mission briefing via secure communication, his expression showing both relief and amazement at the successful outcome. Lieutenant Chun, your accomplishment will be studied and analyzed for years to come. You've demonstrated capabilities that redefine what's possible in military aviation under extreme conditions. The recognition of Sarah's achievement began immediately, but her focus remained on the mission's outcome rather than personal recognition. She spent the following days assisting with the intelligence analysis of the FOB Kestrel situation and providing technical insights that helped other units prepare for similar threats. The coordinated attack on military installations had been disrupted by the successful evacuation of FOB Kestrel, but the threat continued to evolve. Sarah's mission had provided critical intelligence about enemy capabilities and tactics, contributing to the broader defense against the coordinated attack on U.S. military networks. The aircraft maintenance analysis revealed that the C-130 had performed beyond its design specifications during the mission. Multiple systems had operated at maximum capacity, and the airframe had been subjected to stress levels that exceeded normal operational limits. The aircraft's successful performance under these conditions validated the design and demonstrated the capabilities of both the machine and its pilot. Sarah's approach to the post-mission analysis was characteristic of her preparation-focused mindset. She studied every aspect of the mission, analyzing the decisions and techniques that had contributed to the successful outcome. Her goal was to identify lessons that could be applied to future operations and to improve the training programs for other pilots. The implications of the mission extended beyond the immediate rescue of 43 personnel. Sarah had demonstrated that properly prepared pilots could operate under conditions that exceeded normal parameters, opening new possibilities for military operations in extreme environments. Her techniques and procedures became the foundation for new training programs and operational doctrines. The weekend warrior who had prepared for impossible scenarios had accomplished the impossible mission. The evacuation of FOB Kestrel under extreme weather conditions had saved lives, disrupted enemy operations, and demonstrated capabilities that redefined the boundaries of military aviation. Sarah's years of preparation had culminated in a mission that would be remembered as one of the most significant achievements in military aviation history. The storm that had challenged every aspect of her preparation had been conquered through skill, knowledge, and determination. The 43 personnel from FOB Kestrel were safe, the strategic intelligence had been preserved, and the coordinated attack on military installations had been disrupted. The mission was complete, but the recognition of its significance was just beginning. 6 months after the evacuation of FOB Kestrel, Sarah Chen stood before a joint session of military aviation leadership at the Pentagon, delivering a briefing that would reshape how the United States military approached extreme weather operations. The presentation screen displayed detailed analysis of her 72-hour mission, breaking down each decision, technique, and innovation that had made the impossible rescue successful. The audience included generals, admirals, and senior officials from across the military aviation community. These were individuals who had collectively overseen thousands of missions, managed complex operations, and made decisions that affected global military strategy. Yet they listened with rapt attention as Sarah methodically explained how proper preparation and innovative techniques could extend operational capabilities beyond previously accepted limits. The mission parameters exceeded established safety protocols by significant margins, Sarah explained, her voice steady and professional. However, the successful outcome demonstrates that theoretical aircraft capabilities, when properly understood and applied, can enable operations in conditions previously considered impossible. General Patricia Coleman, the Air Force Chief of Staff, studied the data with obvious interest. Lieutenant Chen, your analysis suggests that we've been operating under self-imposed limitations that don't reflect the true capabilities of our aircraft and properly trained personnel. What are the implications for our operational doctrine? Sarah's response was immediate and precise. Ma'am, the implications are significant. With proper training and preparation, we can extend our operational envelope to provide support in conditions where conventional wisdom would dictate mission cancellation. This capability could be decisive in scenarios where lives depend on reaching the unreachable. The presentation continued for 2 hours, covering every aspect of the mission from the initial weather analysis to the final landing procedures. Sarah's technical expertise and analytical approach provided insights that challenged established operational practices and opened new possibilities for military aviation in extreme environments. The response from the military aviation community was immediate and comprehensive. Within weeks of Sarah's Pentagon briefing, new training programs were established to teach extreme weather operations to selected pilots. The techniques she had developed through years of independent study became part of official training curricula, and her mission analysis became required reading for advanced aviation courses. But the most significant change was in how the military viewed the potential of its personnel. Sarah's achievement had demonstrated that exceptional capability could emerge from unexpected sources, and that proper preparation could overcome perceived limitations. The weekend warrior who had been dismissed as a part-timer had proven that dedication and preparation were more important than full-time status. The Air National Guard underwent a fundamental reassessment of its training programs and personnel evaluation procedures. Sarah's success had highlighted the fact that part-time personnel could develop capabilities that exceeded those of full-time professionals, given proper motivation and preparation. The traditional hierarchy that favored active duty over guard personnel began to evolve toward a more merit-based system. Sarah's promotion to Major came with assignment to the newly created Extreme Weather Operations Center at Grayson Air National Guard Base. The facility was designed to develop and test techniques for aviation operations in conditions that exceeded normal parameters. Sarah's role was to lead the development of training programs and operational procedures that would enable other pilots to achieve similar capabilities. The Extreme Weather Operations Center attracted pilots from across the military aviation community who wanted to learn the techniques that had made the FOB Kestrel mission possible. Sarah's approach to training was characteristically thorough, emphasizing the importance of comprehensive preparation and systematic skill development. Exceptional performance under extreme conditions isn't about natural talent, Sarah explained to her first class of students. It's about preparation that exceeds normal requirements and the willingness to study scenarios that others consider impossible. When the impossible mission arrives, you need to already know how to execute it. The training programs at the Extreme Weather Operations Center became the most demanding in military aviation. Students underwent intensive preparation that covered every aspect of extreme weather operations, from advanced meteorology to aircraft systems analysis. The courses were designed to develop the same comprehensive understanding that had enabled Sarah's successful mission. Major Torres, one of the medics who had been evacuated from FOB Kestrel, joined the training program as an instructor in combat medical procedures. Her experience during the mission provided valuable insights into the medical challenges of extreme weather operations and the importance of maintaining patient care under adverse conditions. Lieutenant Chun's flying during our evacuation was so smooth that we were able to perform medical procedures that would have been impossible under normal turbulent conditions, Major Torres explained to her students. The lesson is that exceptional piloting skills can enable medical interventions that save lives in situations where conventional approaches would fail. The strategic implications of Sarah's mission continued to influence military planning and operational doctrine. The successful evacuation of FOB Kestrel had demonstrated that properly prepared forces could operate effectively even when communications were disrupted and conventional support was unavailable. This capability became a cornerstone of new doctrines for distributed operations and resilient force structures. The intelligence gathered from the FOB Kestrel personnel had provided crucial insights into the coordinated attack on military communications infrastructure. The information contributed to the development of new defensive measures and communication protocols that were more resistant to electronic warfare attacks. Sarah's mission had strategic significance that extended far beyond the immediate rescue of 43 personnel. The aircraft that had carried out the mission, C-130 tail number 847, was retired from active service and placed on permanent display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. The aircraft became a symbol of the capabilities that could be achieved through proper preparation and exceptional skill, inspiring visitors to consider the importance of readiness and dedication. Sarah's personal transformation was less dramatic but equally significant. The quiet weekend warrior who had prepared in isolation for years had become a recognized leader in military aviation. Her expertise was sought by organizations worldwide, and her techniques were studied by pilots from allied nations who wanted to develop similar capabilities. But Sarah's approach to her new role remained consistent with her original motivation. She continued to arrive early, work longer hours than required, and push the boundaries of what was considered possible. The recognition and promotion had not changed her fundamental belief that exceptional preparation was the foundation of exceptional performance. The annual memorial service for the personnel lost in the coordinated attack on military installations became an opportunity to recognize the significance of Sarah's mission. The ceremony honored all who had served during the crisis, but special recognition was given to those whose actions had prevented greater losses and contributed to the successful defense against the coordinated attack. Admiral Michael Harrison, now chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, delivered the keynote address at the memorial service. The coordinated attack on our military infrastructure was designed to exploit our perceived vulnerabilities and limitations. The successful evacuation of FOB Kestrel demonstrated that our actual capabilities exceed our perceived limitations when personnel are properly prepared and motivated. Sarah's speech at the memorial service focused on the broader lessons of the mission rather than her personal achievement. The mission was successful because of the preparation of everyone involved, from the maintenance crews who ensured the aircraft was ready, to the medical personnel who provided life-saving treatment, to the intelligence analysts who provided critical information. Exceptional performance is always a team effort, even when it appears to be individual achievement. The legacy of Sarah's mission extended beyond military aviation to influence civilian emergency response and disaster relief operations. The techniques she had developed for extreme weather operations were adapted for use by civilian agencies responsible for rescue operations in severe weather conditions. Her analysis of aircraft capabilities under extreme conditions contributed to new safety standards and operational procedures for civilian aviation. The training program she had established at the Extreme Weather Operations Center expanded to include civilian pilots and emergency responders. The facility became a center of excellence for extreme weather operations, attracting students and researchers from around the world who wanted to learn the techniques that had made the impossible mission possible. Sarah's approach to leadership reflected the same principles that had guided her preparation for the mission. She emphasized the importance of comprehensive preparation, systematic skill development, and the willingness to challenge conventional limitations. Her leadership style was characterized by high standards, thorough preparation, and the belief that exceptional performance was achievable through proper training and dedication. The Weekend Warrior program throughout the military underwent significant changes as a result of Sarah's achievement. The traditional view of part-time personnel as less capable than full-time professionals was replaced by a more nuanced understanding that recognized the potential for exceptional capability regardless of duty status. New programs were established to identify and develop the hidden potential of part-time personnel. The Scholarship Fund, established in Sarah's name, provided educational opportunities for military personnel who wanted to develop specialized capabilities in extreme weather operations. The fund emphasized the importance of continuous learning and skill development, supporting personnel who demonstrated the same dedication to preparation that had characterized Sarah's approach to her military service. The technical innovations that Sarah had developed during her years of preparation became part of standard operating procedures for extreme weather operations. Her modifications to aircraft systems, navigation techniques, and communication protocols were adopted by military and civilian organizations worldwide. The Weekend Warrior's independent research had contributed to advances that benefited the entire aviation community. The story of the FOB Kestrel mission became part of military aviation history, studied in service academies and professional military education programs. The mission was analyzed not just for its technical achievements, but for its demonstration of how proper preparation and dedication could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Sarah's final reflection on the mission came during a speech to new graduates of the Air Force Academy. The mission to FOB Kestrel was successful because of years of preparation that preceded the crisis. Every hour spent studying, every simulation session, every technical analysis contributed to the capability that made the rescue possible. The lesson is that exceptional performance begins long before the moment of crisis. The cadets listened with obvious inspiration as Sarah continued her address. You may spend years preparing for missions that never come, developing capabilities that are never tested, and studying scenarios that seem impossible. But when the moment arrives, and it will arrive, you'll be ready. That readiness is what separates those who achieve the impossible from those who accept limitations. The transformation of Sarah Chun from weekend warrior to recognized leader in military aviation was complete, but her fundamental approach remained unchanged. She continued to prepare for challenges that might never come, to study scenarios that seemed impossible, and to push the boundaries of what was considered achievable. The recognition and promotion had not altered her belief that exceptional preparation was the foundation of exceptional performance. The legacy of her mission extended far beyond the immediate rescue of 43 personnel. Sarah had demonstrated that properly prepared individuals could achieve the impossible, that perceived limitations often reflected assumptions rather than reality, and that dedication and preparation were more important than natural talent or favorable circumstances. The weekend warrior who had prepared in isolation for years had become a symbol of the potential that existed within the military's ranks. Her achievement had inspired others to pursue their own paths of exceptional preparation, creating a new generation of personnel who understood that being ready for the impossible was not just possible. It was essential. The story of Sarah Chun and the 72-hour mission that saved FOB Kestrel became a testament to the power of preparation, the importance of challenging conventional limitations, and the potential for extraordinary achievement that exists within ordinary people who are willing to prepare for extraordinary challenges. The weekend warrior had become something more, but the foundation of her achievement remained the same: relentless preparation for the moment when someone would need the impossible to be accomplished. In the end, Sarah's greatest achievement was not the successful completion of an impossible mission, but the demonstration that the impossible was possible for those who were willing to prepare for it. Her legacy would inspire future generations of military personnel to push beyond conventional limitations and achieve capabilities that exceeded all expectations. The weekend warrior had shown that readiness, not luck, determined who would answer the call when the impossible mission arrived. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.